challenge for life world. I will now give the word to Professor.
I'm very honored to have speech before such respectable audience, and now I begin my article. My reflections are carried out within the bounds of a strictly phenomenological research, and in the sequential unfolding and development of these reflections, I will first attempt to show why and how, at the outset, the LGBT phenomenon is constituted in the intersubjective field as an abnormal occurrence, and subsequently, why this phenomenon is constituted as a deadly threat to the live world. In this process, I will rely first and foremost on Edmund Husserl's work, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, as well as on certain studies concerning normality and abnormality. Before turning to my main analysis, let me briefly recall several important scientific conceptions of normality and abnormality, but because of our reglement, I will omit some fragments in my article, namely about Freud's and Durkheim's concepts. I wish to recall Edmund Husserl's phenomenological reflections, from which his understanding of the phenomenon of normality arises. These reflections are developed in his famous work, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, and from there I will render in my own words a fragment that clearly illuminates the nature of the aforementioned understanding. Husserl writes, in the continuous stream of perception of the world, we are not isolated beings, but rather bound together with other human beings. Each of us has our own perceptions, our own memories, our own emotions, moods, and therefore each person in his or her own way carries out the coherence and alignment of what is given as indubitable, or else the downgrading or devaluation of it to the level of something merely probable, dubious, or even to the level of an illusion. Yet, in communal life, each of us can participate in the lives of others. Therefore, the world exists not for human beings separated from one another, but for human society. And this is so because the constitution of the commonality of the perceived world is always at work. In the course of this constitution, validities, in German Geltung, and meanings, in German Bedeutungen, are often modified, accompanied by reciprocal corrections. Therefore, although intersubjective disagreements are frequent, it is through such processes of correction, collective critique, and discussion that a certain level of concord can be attained. Yes, in such intersubjective mutual understanding, my experience and its acquisitions are connected with the experiences and acquisitions of others. And what presents itself as having a normal character is precisely this concord of validities, that is, the intersubjective unity within diversity of validities and what is valid. Accordingly, from the phenomenological discussions of Husserl, we can draw certain conclusions. The concept of the normal implies the mutual attunement, the mutual concord of the validities and senses, scenes, of objective circumstances that are intersubjectively constituted, even though this attunement is often achieved by a quite complex, uneven process, and moreover not infrequently bears a relative character. It is precisely as a result of this process of mutual alignment that certain apodicticities of the life world are constituted, among them those that belong to the dimension of human behavior. activity, relations, in general the social dimension. Hence, in the life work, apodictic status belongs to that which, in the practice of intersubjective constitution, is established as always indubitable. Put simply, apodictic is that which in our life work appears to the majority as ordinary and traditionally indubitable. That day rains and night falls, that autumn is followed by winter, that people are born and die, that the living raise and the newborn, while the dead are buried, that someone is Georgian, someone French, someone Chinese, someone is a woman, someone a man, something is scientifically substantiated and something else is not. That today is a form of communication such as chat is widespread. The range of these apodicticities of the live world is boundlessly large. It is clear that these apodicticities, constituted in the intersubjective field, don't possess an absolute character. As already noted, they often pass through complex, tangled, and even contradictory processes of formation, and they are never immune to later re-evaluation or revision. But in the constitution of apodicticity, one of the decisive roles is played precisely by the moments of the majority, ordinariness, and historical heritage, that is tradition. Apodictic is that which is now for the majority, ordinarily and traditionally indubitable. These apodicticities of the life world that pertain to human activity often assume a normative character, thereby determining the normality of behavior. Consequently, behavior, and more generally a social phenomenon that in some measure corresponds to this norm, is constituted in the intersubjective field as normal, while that which doesn't correspond to it in a cardinal way, and is incompatible with it, is constituted as abnormal. Therefore, to be even more precise and to proceed from consistent phenomenological considerations, normal behavior means that it is to some extent in accord with a pattern of behavior whose inherent clarity, that is apodicticity, is established in the process of mutually aligned intersubjective experience. Yes, normality is constituted initially in the intersubjective field as the correspondence of behavior to what for the majority is ordinarily, traditionally, an indubitable rule of behavior. But I emphasize the following. Here we are speaking only of the initial, that is the primary form of constitution. So we must also take into account that the life world is essentially characterized by the production of renewed, different, and only new strata of constitution, or at least attempts thereof. Indeed, from time to time, a process arises of reconstituting apodicticities and accordingly norms, both in an intensive historical and in an extensive geographical dimension. That is, across different epochs and distinct contemporaneous civilizations. Sometimes this process assumes the form of what is well known as a re-evaluation of values and the establishment of new ones. Accordingly, there is also a more or less variable dynamic dimension to the constitution of normality. The meaning of normal behavior is not infrequently subject to renewal, correction, modification, or even radical transformation, or at least to attempts thereof. Now I turn to the analysis of the questions I have posed. I note in advance the following. The analysis of the LGBT problem that I am offering does not touch on a rather popular, widely spread and topical theme, namely what threat this social phenomenon poses to national or civilizational traditional values. My analysis proceeds in a wholly different dimension than the ordinary dimension of thinking implied by the popular theme just mentioned. However, this is no way diminishes the great significance for our contemporary epoch of the philosophical, political, and everyday discourse and debates that have developed around this theme. Yes, reflection on these issues and sharp discussions are both very important and very necessary in the world of the 21st century, but at present they don't belong to the tasks of my phenomenological reflections. One of the key components of the multi-stage, complex process of the constitution of own self and the other I, ego, within the intersubjective field is the constitution of sex. The latter begins primarily in the family and then continues in various social institutions and circumstances, in school, among friends, with intimates, acquaintances, or strangers, in all sorts of relationships, including, of course, intimate ones, in higher education, at work, in church, in a religious organization, in sport, in the process of acquiring education individually, in places of entertainment or rest, cafes, bars, restaurants, in the cinema, the theater, and which is very important in our time, on social networks and in television programs, and so on. It is evident that this extremely broad and capacious dimension of constitution requires quite scrupulous and many-sided investigations, which exceed the format of our paper. For the present, we will be content with general, though indubitable explications. Namely, the following situation possesses an obviousness. In the intersubjective field, the sex of one's own self and of the other I, ego, is at the outset constituted as a certain pre-given determinacy for the human being. Yes, initially, sex presents itself to us as a pre-given objectuality, just like 2 eyes, 2 hands, 10 fingers, the digestion of food in the gastrointestinal tract, skin color, origin, nationality, and so on. Hence, to the live words, initial apodicticities belongs human sexual determinism. That I am a man and she is a woman is as clear as that I take in food through the mouth and not through the anal part. How the apodicticities of the live world don't exclude deviations, exceptions, disturbances, including such a form of mental disturbance in which someone attempts to ingest food through the anal part. Moreover, in a certain period and in certain circumstances, they may even proliferate to excess. As already noted, the apodicticities of the live world that belong to human vital activity and behavior more or less acquire a normative character and determine the normality of behavior. Accordingly, the pregivenness of sex, that is sexual determinacy, is constituted as bearing normative weight and from its side also determines the general frame of the normality of behavior. Consequently, any behavior in the field of intersubjective constitution that opposes and violates the norm of the pregivenness of sex initially acquires the sense of abnormality, sense Sinn in Deutsch. But the normality of sexual behavior is determined by yet another important constituent, namely in the intersubjective field, the phenomenon of sexual intercourse is initially constituted as having the sense of a quite definite objectual situation, and the key element of this sense, Sinn in Deutsch, is the so-called phenomenon of penetration, that is, the natural phallus penetration into the natural feminine vagina. This constituted objectual sense of sexual relation as an apodicticity of the life world likewise acquires a normative charge and in turn determines the normality of sexual behavior. Finally, there is yet another constituent of the utmost importance. The sexual relation is from the very beginning displayed in the intersubjective field as possessing a special function. And this function is accorded cardinal significance for the life world. This concerns the so-called function of the continuation of life. Yes, the phenomenon of sexual relation is primarily constituted as the bearer of the function of the continuation of life, and correspondingly as having basic meaningfulness for the life world. Therefore, this functional, sense-laden charge of sexual relation likewise appears as one of the life world's most important apodicticities. It assumes a normative character and thereby also determines the frame of the normality of behavior. So, a sexual relation, which by virtue of its structure, essentially excludes the possibility of the continuation of life, I speak precisely of the possibility, is constituted as an abnormal relation. From these most important constituents of the normality of sexual behavior, it follows that in heterosexuality is constituted in the field of primary intersubjective constitution as normal phenomenon, whereas homosexuality, bisexuality, and transgender are constituted as abnormal phenomena. But generally speaking, abnormal behaviors, for example, mental disorder, are not constituted as organically incompatible and idiosyncratically intolerable for the life world. On the contrary, they ordinarily constitute inseparable, though more or less isolated cells of the latter. They almost always have their own larger or smaller corner, which is more or less set apart from the remaining space of the life world. The same is to be said of sexual abnormality. From of old, in the intersubjective field, this was perceived and constituted as an inseparable part of our life world, which in one period or another might have been the object of greater or lesser censure and condemnation, or even punishment. From all this it follows that abnormal behavior as such don't create an irreconcilable collision in the intersubjective field. Rather, they have always had their own place within it, to which the majority is ordinarily reconciled. Autistic persons or schizophrenics ordinarily live in a clinic sexual lives covertly or openly. Here, there is no collision of a kind that could blow up the integral openness of the life world. Yes, thus it has been always and everywhere in Western civilization, both in ancient and in the Christian, in the Islamic, the Hindu, the Confucian. But I am speaking of that special phenomenon of transformation which presents itself as a great challenge and which gives rise to almost unresolvable, unmanageable deep contradictions within the intersubjective field. What sort of transformation do I have in view? Namely, I have in view LGBT itself, not merely as a deviation variety of sexuality, but as an organized force which has crossed all national bounds and has undoubtedly taken on the character of a powerful international movement. Moreover, today it enjoys the strong support of the liberal democratic world's political establishment and of the preponderant majority of its intellectual elite. And this is not empty moral support, sympathy, or goodwill, not, it is active support, which toward the opponents of LGBT assumes a coercive, censoring, and sometimes punitive form. Thus, in the intersubjective field of the life world, LGBT appears, and that is constituted as an internationally active socio-political agent supported from above, namely as a major international effort to bring homosexuality and transgenderism freely into the public sphere and to establish them as a norm. This precisely is the source of the great challenge and the almost unregulable collision of which I speak. Namely, when there is a vast attempt and exertion to bring freely into the public sphere and to establish as a norm that which is in the intersubjective field primarily constituted as an abnormal phenomenon, and when this attempted exertion represents for the majority as almost a coercive repressive force, then under precisely such conditions, this exertion takes on the character of an intolerable, indigestible, that is destructive challenge. Yes, for this reason, LGBT is constituted in the intersubjective field of the contemporary life world as something with which coexistence and mutual understanding are in principle impossible for the majority. For the majority, there will always remain intolerable and incomprehensible the situation in which an organized public subject is created on the side of sexual deviation, say on the side of homosexuality and transgenderism, whose mission is to establish this deviation as a norm, just as it would be complete incomprehension and absurdity to create a force organized on the side of another sexual deviation. For example, an organization of lovers of anal and oral sex. For all these reasons, in the intersubjective field of the contemporary life world, LGBT presents itself as a destructive threat to the integral wholeness of this world, since it gives rise to an irreconcilable collision and schism, the overcoming of which is impossible by the path of rational discourse and communicative activity. Thank you for attention.